Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. We are on day 80 of self-quarantine. Yes, COVID is still a thing. The world is on fire. There is now a global uprising. Every single city in America, big, small city, has had protesting, peaceful organizing, marches on the streets for the last week continuously in response to the murder of George Floyd. We see now that all the officers that were involved in the murder, took part in the murder, are being tried, being at the helm of the Attorney General, Keith Ellison in Minnesota. But that's just the beginning. Swift action should not be something that we commend. It should be what happens because we have a responsible government, because you have a U.S. government that values the lives of its citizens. But what we're seeing this week is that that is not the case. At a time when leaders, politicians, Democratic mayors across the country should be commending the peaceful protests that have finally organized to a pace where people outside of that community are concerned and need to take action, we should be seeing our lawmakers commend on the streets, not just calling for reforms, but for institutional shifts when it comes to the militarization of our police. But instead, what we are seeing is more militarization. We're seeing surveillance. We're seeing peaceful protesters being monitored and arrested and held for over 24 hours without seeing an attorney, which is unconstitutional. We are losing our rights day by day. So on this show, we're going to talk a little bit about that. News is moving so quickly. We are a weekly show, just to remind you, but we want to be able to provide you with the resources so that you know what's happening, especially if you are out there on the ground, marching in the streets, fighting for, like I said, not reform, but an institutional shift. On today's show, we have Vitali. He is the author of End of Policing. He's an advocate for the Defund Police movement. We have Janos Marton, who is an attorney. He is running for district attorney on a progressive platform in Manhattan. I'm going to talk to him a little bit about what's going on with the NYPD. They are under scrutiny, not something that's new, for how they are dealing with protesters in New York. And we have activist Ralikh from Baltimore. He has been very involved with the efforts on the ground in Baltimore since the uprising in Baltimore a few years ago. He's going to talk about what they're doing locally and how they're working with other organizations across the country. If you're not already, please click subscribe on YouTube, share, like, put it out there. We're a new show, as you know. And if you have it in your heart, we invite you to join us on patreon.com at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for as little as $5 a month. There you will get exclusive interviews, extended interviews, swag, all the stuff that makes the patronage worthwhile. So join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, and you can find us on any platform for podcasting as well. Finally, the mainstream media and general population is starting to understand what is flawed within our police departments and police unions. And there's a movement starting, it's been going on for a while, but it's growing, to defund the police. Our next guest is somebody who's been advocating for this for quite a long time. He is the author of End of Policing. The End of Policing. He's a professor of sociology and the coordinator of policy and social justice project at Brooklyn College. Alex Vitali, thank you so much for joining us. You've been a very busy guy lately. I'm going to start with just, I think, what a lot of us are thinking about on the left. There has been police brutality since the origins of police, but there have been waves of protests across big cities, across America for the last decade or so that have grown in size. What is so different about this moment? Why is it that this stuck with folks in a way that we've never seen before, and conversations like defunding the police are suddenly brought to the table in a very mainstream way?
Well, I think there's some things that led up to the wave of protests in 2016, 2015. And then there's the stuff that we're dealing with right now. And obviously they're related, they're on a continuum. I think the first round of protests was about this growing understanding that mass incarceration and mass criminalization were central tools to reproducing racial inequality in the United States. And when the protests broke out over the deaths, the police murders of Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Mike Brown and so many others, there was kind of this sense coming from there was this language coming from the government at all levels, from Obama, from local mayors. Don't worry, we're going to fix this. We're going to give them implicit bias training. We're going to have some police community encounter sessions. We're going to give them body cameras, and it's going to get better. Mm-hmm. And 5 years later, it's no better. It's not better. And I think that's part of the level of outrage that we're seeing, is that nothing has changed. And the folks who trotted out all these ideas, they don't have anything new to offer us. Mm. If people watched Obama the other night on his Zoom thing, he became instantly irrelevant to this conversation. Wow. He had absolutely nothing to offer us. All he could do was say, we wrote this great report and we tried to implement it, and we should keep trying to implement it. Well, let me tell you, it's been implemented. Minneapolis in particular was one of the centers, the shining stars of implementing all this stuff, and it didn't make any difference.
You look at cities like New York, where there are protests in every borough, almost every neighborhood at this point over the last week in response to the Mayor de Blasio's, he's been pretty much, frozen, I think is probably the best way of saying it. He has commented, and he's been in a very public struggle with the police union in New York for a long time, made note out of the situation that unfolded when Officer Pantaleo murdered Eric Garner, and all the protests emerged from that. And since then, Mayor de Blasio has revealed himself to be pretty beholden to the police union in New York. But playing the devil's advocate here, just to play it from his perspective, in his mind, the way he said it publicly, violence has gone down in this city. Crime has gone down in this city. New York is, on most given days, the safest big city in America. He stopped stop and frisk. And so from his perspective, when asked, he says, there has been a difference in the way police have conducted themselves in New York. There has been a difference in the way crime has been handled in New York. But what you're saying is that these tactics, the body cameras, stop and frisk, that they haven't worked, or they haven't worked to activists. So how do you respond to mayors across America are saying, we have implemented changes, but, there are bad apples, as they like to say, in the police force that, do not understand, the amount of force that they can exert, or whatever the reasoning is. I'm just playing devil's advocate here to put the other perspective out there. What's the response from?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, right? So on the one hand, we have this narrative that the problem of policing is about a few bad apples, and if we just get rid of those bad apples, either through accountability mechanisms or retraining or whatever, that will fix policing. There's also this narrative that policing is the solution to crime and to all kinds of other problems. And one of the things we know is that the amount of policing and the level of crime are not particularly connected. The number of police in New York has gone up and down by many thousands of officers, and it has had no impact on the overall crime rate. During the early days of the Bloomberg administration, he reduced the headcount of the NYPD by 5,000 officers, and crime fell every year during that and after. Why is it that we continue to expand the police budget when crime is at a 25 to 30-year low? De Blasio himself has increased the police budget in the last 5 years by over $1 billion. So we need to really rethink this over-reliance on policing and this idea that the police are the solution to all our problems, and that policing can be fixed by weeding out a few bad apples.
So where is this money going? If they're expanding the budgets and cities across America are becoming safer, Is it going to counterterrorism? Is it going to technology? I mean, where's the money going?
Part of the problem, right, is that we're in the midst of this process of turning every problem under the sun, especially in poor communities and communities of color, over to the police to manage. The schools don't work. Let's fill the schools with school police. There's no mental health services. Let's turn that over to the police. We've got mass homelessness. Let's use police to manage that problem. Right. And so communities have been told that the only government resource they can have to deal with these problems is police. And so they have real problems. And when the only choice is police or nothing, they demand more police services. They call 911. And we've got to break the back of this idea that the only thing communities can have to solve their problems is more police.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of how the police, and every city is different, of course, but let's use New York as an example just because it's so visible. The police union has an extraordinary amount of power in the city, and it runs more conservative, and yet our mayors on the right or the left have been pretty beholden to them. Why is it that the police union has this much power in comparison to, say, like the teachers union or, nurses union or healthcare workers that are, probably just as much employed in the city as police are?
I mean, those other unions have power too. I mean, the healthcare workers and teachers, they do have power, and it's substantial. But, there's been this tendency for them to each stay in their lane, to have a very narrow agenda. We've got this labor movement that has no social agenda, or a very muted one, a sense of a broader social responsibility. So if the healthcare union can get another, $30 billion for healthcare spending, they don't really care what happens to the rest of the budget. If the teachers can get a bigger pension, they don't really care what the implications are for homelessness or hunger among their own students. I mean, I don't mean to be uncharitable to those unions. I'm part of the teachers union and a longtime officer, but I feel like we need to take more responsibility for the overall well-being of the city. And in a sense, we've given police a pass to put forward their version of this, which is the solution to every problem is hire more of us and give us more pay. In addition, they've become the kind of repository in places like New York and a lot of big cities for a whole set of really deeply conservative forces. They become the kind of spokespeople for deeply right-wing ideologies that in many cases are openly racist. And so politicians defer to them in an effort to neutralize right-wing attacks against them politically.
Interesting. Okay. But in cities, I mean, most big cities in America, they're Democratic run, as the right wing likes to reiterate over and over, that these are Democratic cities. So why do they even need to respond? Just the way that, in a red state, many lawmakers don't have to respond to Democrats. Why is it that these Democratic mayors have to respond to right wing, the right wing who's using the police as a tool?
I think it's a great question, because you look at a case like New York, so many of their members don't even live in New York. And they don't necessarily have the best interests of New York City in mind when they make their decisions about political endorsements and campaign giving. And I think a big part of what we have to do is we have to make the political support of those unions toxic.
Right. That
politicians who take their money and take their endorsements cannot be our friends. Because every time we embrace a police-centered solution to a community problem, we're undercutting the possibility of an alternative, more humane, restorative approach. Because that police-centered approach comes with an ideology, this kind of toxic thin blue line ideology that says that police are the only thing that keeps society together. The constant threat of coercion and punishment. That completely undermines the idea that we could actually help people, we could actually build people up. So we need to out those politicians. And the good news is here in New York, just in the last few days, a good number of politicians have gone back through their campaign funds, identified the money they've received from police unions, and given it all away to mutual aid funds and bail funds and other community interventions. And this is the future of disempowering those police unions.
Can we talk a little bit about community policing and how that differs from it's one of the solutions that's being presented in cities across America, shifting to community policing versus what you were saying just now. Police they don't live in the cities. They're being brought in from who knows where to police neighborhoods that they're not familiar with, that don't reflect their upbringing, whatever their values are. I mean, if you're from a neighborhood, you believe in that neighborhood. You know the people that you're interacting with. But when you're importing officers from other who knows where, there's a different take. So can we talk about community policing and whether that's a real option?
Yeah, so, it sounds good. This idea of, of course we want the police to understand the community and figure out who the real bad guys are. And it's not my nephew, it's those other kids. Of course, your nephew is in fact dealing drugs and hanging out in the park with other kids sometimes. But community policing was a reform to respond to the unrest of the 60s and 70s. It was a PR campaign to try to win over the community, to try to get the community to be a source of intelligence for crime fighting. But also, it rests fundamentally on this logic that the community needs to bring all its problems to the police so that they can work out a solution. But this is exactly the problem, right? Is turning everything over to the police to manage. Because, what tools do the police have to manage our community problems? They got guns and handcuffs and ticket books. They don't have access to affordable housing. They don't have access to high quality drug treatment. They don't have access to summer jobs for young people, right? We don't need their tools to solve our community problems. We need actual solutions.
So when you talk about defunding the police, how does that play out? How do you go from having this idea that's catching fire to turning it into policy in cities that may not have democratic leadership and in cities that do?
Tomorrow, there are no police. No, that's not what we're talking about. Right. So there are campaigns underway all across the country that were happening before the events of this last week, calling for budgetary interventions to shift funding from police to community identified needs. Even in Minneapolis, there was a robust campaign calling for shifting $45 million. They had a very specific target linked to things like attrition and cutting overtime and getting rid of some particularly problematic programs, and then putting that money into specifically identified community needs. Here in New York, the Policing and Social Justice Project that I coordinate has called for $1 billion cut to the NYPD to be implemented over several years, again, through attrition and cuts to overtime and getting rid of some surveillance technology. And also we'd like to see the end of school policing, which is paid for out of the education department budget. So these are very practical campaigns rooted in communities that are the most heavily policed, calling for very specific interventions. And that's part of why this has been such a focus of the current protests. This didn't just fall out of the air. These movements have been percolating for years, but they haven't been getting any press attention. They've been ignored by politicians in many cases. And hopefully now that's going to change. So
we have police that are in schools. We have police that are patrolling communities of color. But what are they looking for? I mean, what do most police officers in big cities across America? I know this sounds like a very basic question, but if you were to roll back to 1993, we'd be having I'm sure your answer would be very different than what it is today. What are police actually policing?
Right. So if you watch a lot of television, you think that they're chasing serial killers and bank robbers.
Right.
But that's not what real police do every day. You know, the average patrol officer makes at most one felony arrest a year.
Wow.
What they're doing is they're managing the symptoms, the consequences of neoliberal austerity, right? We've created this economic system that's pushing wealth up the economic ladder, subsidizing the already most successful parts of the economy, in hopes that there'll be some magic trickle down of resources to the rest of us. I can tell you, I've been a public employee for over 20 years. I haven't seen any trickle down yet. And then that system, right, produces tremendous inequality. It produces mass homelessness and mass untreated mental illness, mass economic precarity, that people get involved in black market activity. And police spend their time managing exactly these problems. They are going and harassing homeless people. They're trying to deal with mentally ill people. They're policing black markets of drugs and sex work and petty theft with not a lot to show for a lot of that work. And that's what policing really do. They manage this disorder that this economic system produces in a way that allows that system to keep plumbing, to keep, you know, pumping right along, extracting more wealth from the society.
So the terms police and white supremacy are being discussed openly. I think then movements, this type of language was very common, but it was sort of one of those things that you have to exercise caution when saying it in the mainstream press, because you'd be immediately dismissed, right? But now people are on CNN talking about police and white supremacy. A few years ago, you may recall that the FBI, of all organizations, agencies, was investigating police departments across the country for white supremacy, for organized white supremacy. And I think this is important for us to keep in mind, because it's not like an idea. It's not like people who just yes, there are people who feel this way and who have this ideology, but there's a real organized effort internally within police departments across the country. Can you explain a little bit more about like how that functions and how aware maybe city government is of what's happening within the police departments?
Right. So I think most political leaders have turned a blind eye to this, but we know that there are white supremacist groups who are infiltrating police departments. We've had investigations and we've exposed officers who are throwing up white supremacist signs and photographs, who are wearing white supremacist tattoos, who are participating in white supremacist chat boards and social media conversations. And really, this speaks to the ridiculousness of some of the Obama police reform agenda. He cannot bring himself to say that there is explicit racism in American policing. And so he trots out this nonsense about implicit bias training, which imagines that the problems of race in policing are, because the individual officers need to be told that, racism is a problem and could you please just shoot fewer black people in the future, that we're going to have some kind of encounter session. Mm-hmm. It's insulting to my intelligence. It's insulting to the intelligence of the police officers. It's ridiculous. There is explicit racism in American policing, but also there is structural racism at work here.
Right.
That goes far beyond the conscious or unconscious predilections of individual officers. I mean, I firmly believe that the majority of police officers in the United States, many of whom are non-white, are not racist or not white supremacists. It just doesn't matter. The racism is in the decision of political leaders to turn the problems of black and brown communities into policing problems, to use criminalization to demonize and incarcerate and harass those populations. That's where the racism is. And that's a question of political accountability. And when we put all our focus on police accountability, we let those politicians off the hook.
Right. I mean, it's been so encouraging to see hundreds, sometimes thousands of people outside the homes of the mayors of LA and New York. To see
and Chicago and other places,
right,
yeah.
demanding accountability. Before we wrap up, there's been some breaking news this week about surveillance programs that the Trump administration has put forward through agencies, whether it's legal is a whole other question, but, the DEA suddenly being able to survey people and share that information with other agencies, including the police. And you mentioned surveillance with the police department, especially in New York. There's a history of this. There's a lot to be said about two things that I think I want to understand from your perspective a little bit more about. How many members of the police departments across the country are recruited, are veterans that come home from war and may have PTSD, may have been trained to shoot first, not ask questions, whatever, frankly, our military does abroad, and how much of it is also tied in with the surveillance programs of surveying, American citizens?
Yeah. So, the military veteran thing kind of cuts kind of funny. Mm-hmm. We don't really have a lot of evidence that this is a big problem. And they do make up a growing proportion of police. They usually get, extra points on the civil service exam. And many police departments require either a certain number of years of education or military service, so that this gives them, a leg up if they didn't go to community college or whatever. But the irony is that what we hear from some of those officers is that they're appalled.
Wow.
At the use of force by American police. Over and over again, we hear stories from former vets who are like, we would never have been allowed to use force on that way on the streets of Baghdad.
Wow. Like tear gas, right? For example?
Well, no, like shooting people without probable cause. Right? The disregard for lives that takes place in American policing. And they do tend to be a little bit older and more worldly than the kids who just come up, go to community college, and then take the police exam. So the bigger problem really is at the top of this, which is the way in which we militarize the policing mission, which again is a political problem. Telling the police to wage a war on crime and a war on gangs and a war on drugs and a war on immigrants, and a war on terror, and then equipping them with all this military hardware and creating all these paramilitary units, including gang units and gun suppression units, and just letting them loose on people. So that's, I think, where the problem of militarization is, much more than whether or not a particular person, served in the military before. And as to the question of surveillance, it's taking a lot of forms. There's more CCTV, there's more license plate readers, there's more shot spotter technology, but there's also the hidden tools, the algorithms that are being used to do predictive policing. And I want to give a shout out to the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and the Stop Project in New York, who are really taking on these surveillance technologies. The Post Act in New York is an attempt to get at least some transparency about that that's currently being debated by the City Council. And all these technologies, there's no oversight, there's no public disclosure in many cases, and they're being used to advance the penetration of policing into even more aspects of our daily lives. And this includes body cameras. So we need to push back on all these toys that the police have given themselves. And I'll just add one more thing, which is in some cases, the money for this is not coming from the feds. It's not coming from the city government. It's coming from private philanthropies. Police foundations of all kinds that receive money from elite business interests to prop up policing to serve their interests. And it creates a corrupt relationship, and there needs to be a lot more exposure of this.
Yeah, they have, in New York in particular, there's some famous, luncheons and galas where, everybody of note, Democrat, Republican, shows up and cuts their big checks, because they don't want to be on the wrong side of the police union. Alex, where do you see this going in the next I'll say 6 months because things are moving
Yeah,
so quickly.
well, it's really hard to say. I mean, the situation in Washington, I think, is so bad.
Yeah.
Trump has made clear that he's going to double down on authoritarianism. He's going to unleash federal law enforcement and possibly the military to try to suppress these protests and the movements that are building around them. And the mainstream leadership of the Democratic Party is not offering us anything. I think that's part of why the protests are as vociferous and confrontational as they are, is that there's no sense in which either party is going to offer them any way out of this mess. Mm-hmm. I think there's more room for optimism at the local level, where people are really organizing at the community level around these budgetary questions, around identifying alternative community needs that can be addressed without policing. Mm-hmm. And it's my hope that the energy from these protests will get channeled into that kind of activity, along with other things. Because it's pretty clear now that these protests are not just about policing.
Right.
This is a kind of generational crisis, a sense of hopelessness about the economy, the environment, and the failure of both political parties to have any kind of plan to do anything about it.
Yeah. Alex, so interesting. I have like 10 more questions for you, but you have to move on to other media because you're a busy guy. Very grateful for your work and for bringing this to life to so many folks who may not have been even aware of this movement. I would love to have you on again to talk more, but thank you very much. I really
You bet. Let's do that when things calm down a little bit.
There are uprisings happening across the country in every city, major city, small city, and now community across the United States, and it's become a global movement as well. This doesn't happen overnight. It takes real organizing to get to a point where these cities and these movements can sustain themselves. Baltimore, as many of you are aware, had an uprising just a few years ago, and once again, people are on the streets of Baltimore more demanding change. We are very grateful to have one of the lead organizers. He's Deputy Director of Organizing Black. Ralikh Hayes is here to join us to tell us a little bit about what's happening on the ground in Baltimore right now. How you doing? Safe? Okay?
Okay, I'm safe right now. I'm tired, but I'm energized, right? Like I had to take the last 24 hours or so to really hunker down, get some rest, do some planning with the rest of my team and community members, because there's folks just all... We're at the point now where there are literally spontaneous protests popping up every time I blink. Wow. So I think today there were about 3 or 4 occurring in different communities. I literally just got a call that there was one occurring in Bel Air, Maryland, which is a very affluent area outside of the city limits, about 4,000 folks. Also a really racist area. So like just hearing that in these really predominantly white and typically racist areas of the city or the surrounding areas where people who have led the city have gone to move, that protests are happening is really shocking to me. Even during our uprising, during Freddie Gray at its height, didn't have this kind of energy.
You mentioned Freddie Gray. Let's go back in history, just a few years, obviously, because not much time has gone on. But how much has changed locally since the uprisings around Freddie Gray in the Baltimore area?
Well, systemically, nothing. But in people's hearts and minds, politically, I think there has been a significant change, particularly in the younger population. Those of us that were in like high school when Trayvon Martin happened. A lot of us are now leaders in the community, starting our own job, businesses, organizations, working places, and, we're politicized. So I see a shift, a deep shift. We're currently in the middle of a primary election that we're not exactly sure how it's going to go. I don't know if you've seen, but there's been some severe irregularities, transparency issues, votes missing, people not getting ballots, people getting the wrong ballots, people being told they can't vote, right, because they've already voted or already received a ballot. All the issues that you could think of voter suppression, kind of similar to like the 1960s and civil rights movement, and during those times, all these things are seeming really like history repeating itself, except it's happening in a much more condensed fashion. Right, like our uprising was only 5 years ago, and Trayvon Martin was only a few years before, Mike Brown. Right. So like I'm seeing these things come much closer together, and this one is almost looking to be a little bit more sustained, I think. I won't even say almost, it is.
So you had an uprising, 5 years ago, and it does take, I don't think people understand the level of organizing it takes to fight off this injustice, to get people on the streets, to push away instigators, to push away who knows who might infiltrate. I mean, we're seeing so many reports now of folks showing up and looting to distract and turn people against the movement. But now, you as an organizer are communicating with other cities around the country and learning from them. I mean, what kind of things are you learning from other cities to make sure that your organizing on the ground is?
I mean, we've always been in community with each other, and have been sharing skills post our uprisings and like the incidents that happened in 2015 across the country, where like we'll say that certain cities had actual uprisings where they were like, a police murder cities, and there were the cities that were like active because they were supporting other cities. But all of us have been in deep community and learning, and we've done actions together and different things across the country. I won't get into too much detail, but I've built a lot of trust with these folks over the years that makes us much more ready for this moment. And so what it looks like is more complex actions, better infrastructure as these things snap together. We have jail support, we have bail funds, right? Like people aren't scrambling 3 days later about how do we do these things. We're on it.
Right.
We are really just, I think, in a space of being ready. And yes, it does take organization, but I also want to, be clear that like we are also holding space for those who have never, been to maybe never been to an action ever before, or never planned one or a protest, because they have a reason to be angry too. And so yes, we're seeing a lot of that. And I think to be clear that it's not just organizers who have gotten us to that moment, but it's just everyday people who have decided to act and see other people and feeling the urge to act, right? It's our job as organizers to hold that space and be like, this is actually how you make this sustainable. This is how you turn this from just anger to a strategy, right? And so I think that's where we're at this moment. And it's tiring because like, I'm literally getting requests every hour about how to help me plan this protest. Can you attend and help us like do this thing? We're real clear as organizers also about not policing people's rage and grief, right? So like, while we're not going to go loot, we're not going to condemn folks that are doing that, because you also have to think about like, in the same reason we're saying abolish the police because crime only happens in neighborhoods where people are lacking resources. We have to remember that we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? Where 3% of the country is out of work. And there are people in Maryland and in Baltimore that I personally know who have not received unemployment or any benefits. Right. And still out of work, right? So like, granted, looting hasn't happened here, but being clear about talking about the larger context of this moment we're in, right? Because it wouldn't have also happened without us being in a pandemic where people would legitimately have nothing left to lose but for change. Because what would have happened if the country were to open back up, right? And nothing's changed. There's no relief for renters, right? No relief for folks for their other bills, right? Like seriously, not relief, because what forbearance does for homeowners, renters, or whatever, right? What that means is that when all this opens back up, you just owe all that money, right? Instead of then, and if you ain't been working, how you gonna pay it? Or if you haven't been able to get, what unemployment benefits you were promised, because there's so many people applying, what does that mean? So yeah.
Right. It's all the systemic issues that are being revealed that catapulted into this being a much more potent response than probably in the past, which, of course, cities had been under lockdown individually. Not nationwide, and now globally we're seeing. So what kind of pushback is happening locally? I mean, one of the things that we're seeing this week is, the last couple of days, I should say, police forces are cracking down on protesters at a time when they probably should be listening a little bit more, when leadership, democratic leadership, should be saying, let's pause before we push back harder. But given the fact that our federal government is sending all indications that they're not pulling back, I mean, what are you seeing locally in Baltimore?
So I'm seeing in Baltimore, I think that we're not as tense as other cities, partially because of the consent decree, partially because...
Well, what is that?
So the consent decree was the agreement that the city entered with the Department of Justice and the court system to reform the Baltimore City Police Department.
Right.
I personally don't think it's all that great. I'm not a fan of reform. My organization is an abolitionist organization because we don't believe you can reform the system of policing. You can do reforms that are harm reduction, but you can't like actually reform the heart of that system.
So when you say abolitionist, what does that mean to most?
So what that means, let me be very clear. It does not mean a world without public safety, right? It does not mean that like all of a sudden there chaos would reign and, you know, people would just be doing insanity in the streets. A really good example of that is on Monday, there was a protest organized and led by the young people, talking 16 and under, right? And they were very want cops there, 15,000 people, and not one incident. Everybody was safe, right? That's abolition in practice, right? Because as a community, we can keep each other safe. We don't actually need police to do it, right? Or you could talk about the fact that in affluent white neighborhoods, how often do you see police, right? Like they actually already live in bubbles of abolition. So like clear that it's not something that's far-fetched. It's just about how we think about what safety looks like.
Fascinating. So in terms of the abolitionist movement, is this catching on, do you think, to folks that are out there?
Yes. I mean, if you search social media, the hashtags defund the police, defend Black lives, you're seeing folks of my generation in particular becoming politicized, again, because of these moments that happened in the past where officers were indicted, but no conviction. And even in the cases where convictions do happen, they get out on appeal because they have a legal body behind them once people stop paying attention, right? Or you have prosecutors overcharging intentionally so that they know the officers will get off, right? And so people are really being clear that like this system is no longer it. And then as people are sitting here, as people are watching, people that weren't abolitionists in the last 2 weeks are quickly shifting because they're literally watching people getting beat everywhere across the country. Journalists shot on live TV, right? Like it's really hard to stay in support of something when you see those things.
So what is the local political community looking like right now? I mean, are you finding more institutional Democrats, even more institutional Black Democrats who are in office, being a little bit more sensitive and aware and open to this conversation?
So I think they're performing the act of being more sensitive and aware, but I think actions show where you really land, and we have to see the proof of that. Because ultimately they're trying to do those things as methods of social control, right? Like they want to calm this thing down, and politicians and those in power all over the country are freaking out because they figured, oh, the officers got charged, protests will stop, and didn't stop. Oh, we just charged the rest of the officers, maybe protests will stop. We raised it's bigger than just George Floyd. It's bigger than Freddie Gray, right? It's Corinne Gaines and all the other folks that have been murdered by police, right? It's so much bigger than that. It's really about like people getting the things they need to just live a basic life, right? That's all really what folks want, and then to be treated fairly, right? And the system that America runs on, capitalism, has never been set up to be fair to poor people or Black people, which most of the time Black people are both, right? Like they're both Black and poor at the same time. But let's also be clear that it is also against working class folks, right? Like there are plenty of people, mom and pop shops, who thought they were going to be relatively secure, for life, and now have had to completely deplete their savings. Right. Like, so let's be clear that the system was really just not made for more than a small handful of us to be able to thrive. And then we have a government that was like, all right, we're going to give you this $1,200 payment. And then billionaires, got almost $500,000 or $1 billion, whichever one. But like, that's the kind of inequality we're talking about.
So it's so interesting you're saying this, and I'm thinking about the neoliberal experiment, and I call it an experiment because it was the first time anything like that had been played out, and it's been in effect in the Democratic Party for the last 40 years. And the neoliberal experiment, of course, brought us the crime bill, brought us stop and frisk in cities across America, brought us these policing policies, privatization of prisons. And when you think about the children who were born in the 90s, when this...
Me, born in 92.
Exactly, perfect. So when you talk about 16-year-olds and young people out on the streets organizing, they're the products, the children of 1 out of 3 Black men being put in jail unjustly. So compare that to the 60s and what was happening. What are some of the similarities and some of the differences?
So I think you have to even take it a step further, right? Back and compare it to Jim Crow, right? Like all these things are just new names for social control, right? Or a way to put Black people in their social place, which is not to be above those with means and the control of the means of production, right? Like that's really what it is, right? Like the neoliberal experiment was a way to show people like, oh, we care, while actually doing much greater harm. right? Which is why folks have turned against, Democratic faces like Hillary Clinton, right? And Bill Clinton and, even Joe Biden, right? Like folks are holding their feet to the fire. There's a reason Hillary Clinton didn't win, right? And that was because she didn't listen to Black folk. And also, let's be clear that it was a racist response to having Obama as a president and the rise of like the Black Lives Matter movement, where white folks who were racist were like, we're losing our country. And Trump was speaking their language.
Right.
Right. And so, like, let's be clear that racism has been organized in this country much longer than we as Black people have been able to fight.
Yeah, it's a means of social control and profit. I mean, when you say means of production, I think a lot of folks who what I find so interesting about this moment, because it's the pandemic and because we're facing 40% unemployment, is there are people who have been neoliberals, probably will still identify themselves as neoliberals, and it's like the wheels are turning and they're starting to realize the intersectionality, that class issues are racial issues, are even gender issues in some cases, and they're starting to wrap their minds around it and connect the dots. And showing up in the streets and learning from people that they're in movements with, they're understanding, that racism is a tool of capitalism. So how is that? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
please. The floor is yours.
So, so that reminds me of like organizing Black has three main areas, right? Political education, direct action, and participatory governance, right? And they're listed in that order for a reason, right? Because political education is the beginning point of like the entry point of where people will come in. And I'll be the first to tell you that most people start with a very reformist like policy and all these things will save us, right? It is through experience, typically, both like lived experience and experience with policy and all the other things that seeing the system fail, that typically shifts people more to abolition. And we've also found that like doing direct action, particularly for Black people, both transforms the practitioner, the person doing the direct action, and the conditions around, right? And when I say direct action, I mean like civil disobedience, sometimes arrestable or non-arrestable, right? But like it changes the conditions, right? Because like some of the best moments and like with people that I didn't know, but and particularly like what I mentioned earlier, folks from other cities, we built trust by doing actions together in other cities, sometimes our own, sometimes theirs, wherever, right? And that allowed me to know that I could rely on, right? And we're in this moment now where people are realizing that like it's worth the risk, particularly when they realize that there's jail and legal support there to help them. Granted, there are physical risks for folks, but, a lot of people really don't have nothing left to lose.
Right. No, that's very powerful in that you having that available. So lessons from past movements, past flare-ups like this, I mean, uprisings, national uprisings, what can you learn?
It's definitely a marathon. We're here for a really long time. And that what's beautiful to me, again, is that I saw the last uprising in 15, and to see people who vehemently disagreed with me about abolition and that like they're good cops, right? Like the system itself isn't corrupt, right? And I don't believe in the good cop myth, because if you're a good cop, you report your coworkers, and then we wouldn't be at this point, because most police who end up killing people have a past history of killing people, right, or abuses and complaints, right? So like can't be good if you're letting your friend or your coworker abuse his power. And so just to see the political growth in people, the want for change, people who I didn't even know were actually paying attention when we were talking, repeating like our political theory back at us or to other people and citing us as sources is beautiful in this moment. And definitely, even if this moment doesn't end with like all the things we want, which it probably won't, right? Like just being a realistic person, I'm here for this moment and the next, right? So it really just gives me the push to see through. And I didn't think I would ever be willing to sit through another uprising after the first, to be honest.
Yeah, it does that to you, right? Ralikh, for folks who want to be better supporters, better activists, who are just starting to show up now, what kind of advice do you have for them?
Organizations are important. Right now isn't necessarily the time to join an organization because we're overwhelmed with requests for things, but you can show your by giving money and showing up to things that we're throwing. Best believe, just say hi. Best believe organizers remember faces, and just stay in contact. Your commitment is what's really going to see you be able to make change, right? Like if you're a commitment to doing this, you're going to follow back up. You have to understand that we are people too, and we're overwhelmed, our calendars, emails, and phones, and I get your want to be involved. Yeah. Be you white or black. And if you're white, there's organizations like Surge for you to join, but we're all a little overwhelmed. And the easiest thing you could do in this moment is send some cash and like sign for an email list and show up when necessary.
Absolutely.
That's the best thing to do, because then we'll handle the political education, right? Like just find an organization. And granted, you might not be in that space forever, but everybody got to start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Ralikh Hayes, stay safe. Thank you for your incredible work. We support you, and for those who are watching and listening, show your love. You're doing great work at Organizing Black, Deputy Director of Organizing Black. Keep up the incredible work and stay in touch.
Thank you. You too.
You are listening and watching The Nomiki Show. Make sure to click subscribe and like and share to get those alerts on YouTube. And if you are not already, please join us on Patreon. It's our patrons who make this show happen. We are an independent media channel. What that means is that we don't have corporate stakeholders pushing us through the algorithms. We're not getting the likes and shares through bots. You guys are what makes this show function. So please, we invite you to join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. New York is not the epicenter of these protests, but there is a long history of Black Lives Matter protests in New York, and pushing back against the NYPD, which has exercised an extraordinary amount of force against protesters for decades. Our next guest is a civil rights attorney. He was a leader in the End Rikers movement. Rikers is a jail in New York, and he is running for Manhattan District Attorney. He's also an old friend of mine. We met back in the days of the Moreland Commission when he was investigating corruption in New York State government. Like, that exists. Janos, I'm so happy you got rid of corruption in New York. You're taking on your next task. Janos Marton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So, Janos, lots happening right now. Yesterday, as of this taping, the NYPD got a ruling from a judge saying that, a New York State judge saying that it was okay for them to detain protesters who they classify as able to arrest for over 24 hours without seeking legal representation. Is this unconstitutional, or am I just blowing this out of proportion?
No, this is absolutely outrageous. It is definitely unconstitutional, although a judge has ruled that it's permissible. To give people a little bit of context, there have been enormous protests throughout the boroughs of New York, all 5 boroughs of New York. A lot of people peacefully marching. Right up until curfews happened, there have been a large number of arrests happening around the curfews. And what the NYPD has done, and you see this sometimes on conservative media as well, is conflating people who are peacefully protesting and, quote, looting. And so the NYPD has asked the judge to allow them to hold people longer than 24 hours, quote, because looters are taking over the city. And the judge basically complied. The judge said that this is an emergency, this is a crisis, and so we can waive this requirement to have people arraigned within 24 hours. I've heard widespread reports that lawyers are having a great difficulty reaching their clients. The local jail is well over capacity, and that's especially disappointing because we've been working on criminal justice reform in this city for years, and for the first time, maybe in decades, our jails actually were under capacity finally before this situation happened, and now they're just overflowing. And, this, in terms of why this ruling came down, I think what's been under talked about, and I haven't seen it mentioned in any of the reporting yet, is that this is a prosecutor who became a judge. And this is very much the system that we're fighting against. Justice Burke was a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office for 12 years. He was elevated to his position by Mayor Bloomberg. And that should tell you enough about where he's coming from. He basically took the NYPD position, and that's where we are right now.
So you're talking about these jails, and you've been a big part of this movement to close these jails. A lot of them have detained people for very long periods of time, people who cannot afford cash bail. So how is, and not to mention that these jails right now have an extraordinary, like the levels of COVID they're basically like COVID breeding grounds because people are in closed, quarters. So what do you think is going to happen given the fact that there's already this cash bail issue, and now who knows who's being, and my guess is that they're probably going to target people of color, just based on the history of the NYPD. What do you think is going to happen?
Here's what's outrageous about the fact that they're holding hundreds and hundreds of people in these dangerous COVID rich conditions. Most of these people will be required under state law to be released once they are actually arraigned. We worked for years to pass bail reform in New York, and under the bail reform laws, there are certain categories of offenses for which you're not allowed to be held pre-trial anymore. That was a huge win that we got in 2019. So most of these protesters are being arrested for sort of nonsense charges, obstructing government administration, disorderly conduct, maybe these things slightly higher than that. They will have to be released. So this is really just the NYPD and the DA's office being, punitive against these protesters, knowing full well that when they actually do get in front of a judge, the judge will be required by law to let them go home. So it's not as if they're even going to be able to use the bail laws to trap protesters in. They know they have the law working against them. And so they're basically running out the clock, trying to make people suffer in jails.
So what are you hearing besides this? I mean, this is just the most recent, a piece of news that is broken through the press. But what are you hearing on the ground from protesters? You're actively campaigning right now. What a time to be campaigning on these issues in Manhattan. What's the latest?
Sure. Well, on the policy front, like what are we actually going to get out of this moment? These protests are going to keep going, and they should keep going until we see leaders actually responding to what people are asking for. A large number of organizations led by Communities United for Police Reform has asked for $1 billion in NYPD budget cuts for the next fiscal year. Now, this is a very time-sensitive, urgent ask and demand because the budget is due on July 1st. So the city council is in the process of negotiating with the mayor. And, first, what's been remarkable to me, Nomi, as somebody who's worked in this space for a long time, when we supported the $1 billion budget cut proposal, and the biggest feedback we've gotten is that it doesn't go far enough, which just really shows you that people have moved an enormous amount. I mean, this would be the biggest NYPD budget reduction in New York history, and for a lot of people, it's not good enough, which I welcome. I welcome that energy, and now we just need council members to listen to their constituents. I've spoken to several elected officials who say they've gotten more emails and phone calls about this issue than any issue in their entire careers. Wow. And so we just need to keep that pressure up. So that's one thing that's happening is this demand for defunding the NYPD. There's also sort of a lot of speculation about whether Mayor de Blasio can continue doing his job. He's totally lost control of the police department. He's lost all political support. He shows no interest in fixing the problems that are breaking out right now. So that is another ongoing thread. And I think it bears mentioning since if you haven't been at the protests yourself, to just lift up that what's been most positive and inspiring for me about the protests is, number one, the number of young Black Lives Matter organizers who are at the front leading these protests. Just some of the most talented young organizers I've ever seen, a new generation of people coming in to leadership, and the fact that the crowds so often are racially diverse and led by young people. I mean, these are all reasons for me to feel optimistic about the direction that we're heading, even though we're in a very difficult week right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. We've been interviewing some of these organizers who came of age during, the Freddie Gray uprisings, or, I mean, it's so powerful to see what they're learning on the ground at such a young age. And it's, that's a bright side of this, is that these movements are building, a generation of leaders that have unfortunately had to go through these extraordinary circumstances to develop the skills of the leaders of a generation. And now there's, possibly hundreds, maybe even thousands of them who will be rising up across America. So can we talk a little bit about the history of NYPD and how they are compared to, I mean, the police forces are different across the country, but New York it's the most diverse place on the planet, literally. I mean, Queens is the most diverse borough, and Bronx comes in second. So when we talk about things like stop and frisk, which does not exist anymore, I mean, you had these policing tactics which were copied throughout the country, but sort of, created or utilized the most in New York, and they were very controversial. So can we talk a little bit about the legacy of the NYPD over the last few years, and what has been fought and what still needs to be done?
Absolutely. And historically, you could probably go back much further than this, but in my observations, the defining moment of the modern NYPD was actually when we had a different horrible president in office, and we were protesting that situation, the 2004 Republican National Convention protests. Mm-hmm. So the Republican National Convention in 2004 was held in New York City. 9/11 was used as a political prop, and New Yorkers responded with enormous protests, and the NYPD responded with enormous brutality and flagrant violations of the Constitution. During those protests, there was what was called kettling, where hundreds of protesters at a time would be trapped by barricades on city streets, not allowed to leave even if they wanted to. And then all of them would systematically be arrested, they'd be zip tied, and they'd be charged. And it took literally a decade, maybe longer actually, for the actual case to wind its way through the courts, the civil rights cases. But ultimately, judges ruled overwhelmingly against the NYPD. Millions of dollars of legal awards were given out to people who had been arrested. And so that was when the modern NYPD sort of set the tone, that they are going to break the rules, not ask for permission, right? But basically just live with the fact that they're going to rack up hundreds of millions of dollars in jury awards, and that they're not going to listen to the rule of law. We saw that again during Occupy Wall Street. I got to share this anecdote. During Occupy Wall Street, at the end of Occupy in Manhattan, the Zuccotti Park area was cleared out by NYPD. They brought in all kinds of big trucks and hundreds of officers arresting people. We went to court in the middle of the night to get an injunction against what they were doing. And we showed up to Zuccotti Park with it. And the police officer on the scene commanding said, "I don't give a damn what your little piece of paper says," about an order from a judge. Wow. So this is how the NYPD operates. They continue to operate this way during the Eric Garner protests. But what we're seeing now, Nomi, is a different level. I've, for my entire life, seen individual rogue police officers behaving violently. I have seen them disobeying court orders. Mm-hmm. What I have never seen at this scale is NYPD officers en masse, entire units, descending on people with batons, acting violently in concert as if directed to by their leadership. That is a new and scary level of violence and illegality that, New Yorkers are responding to now. I feel like we may not be at 7 days of protesting in the streets had they not behaved so violently day 1 and 2. So that is new, and that is very scary.
It's interesting. I as much as kettling might not be allowed anymore, I was at a protest a few years ago in front of, not far from Trump Tower, but it was around Trump Tower, and they did it to me as a journalist, and it was on camera, and I was talking to the head of the unit saying, "You can't do this legally." And this lawyer, who just happened to be walking home, came up to me and he joined the protest, and he got in their face and basically recited the law on camera. It was amazing. But, it's also exactly what you say, in that they just don't care. They don't care that they're violating the law, even when it's on camera, even when an attorney, goes up to their face and cites the law. So I think that's what's really fascinating about this moment, is you have a police force that is being documented over and over again, physically abusing peaceful protesters on camera every single day. And it's as if they do not care. I think that's what's really hard for people to comprehend.
Absolutely. And this is where, I know there's a lot of people tuning into this issue in a meaningful way for the first time. And I had this exchange just this morning where people were asking, well, $1 billion, that doesn't sound like it's solving the problem. And so I just want to walk people through for a second why this particular fight is so important to the broader picture that you're painting there. The police officers in New York always get their way politically, right? They get their way in the moment, like we've just been talking about. They get whatever budget increases they want. They go to Albany and they block criminal justice reform legislation. So they consider themselves an omnipotent political force. The idea behind this $1 billion budget cut is, yes, to scale down the size of the NYPD, absolutely. Yes, to make sure that they don't have access to military-grade weaponry and they can spend city taxpayer money on that. But it's also about setting a message, right? The police never lose politically. If we can take $1 billion from their budget and make sure that that money is spent on summer youth employment programs, mental health programs, after-school funding, and send a message that as a city, as a statement of values, we care about that more than giving the NYPD the money that they want, it's enormous. And I get that it doesn't go far enough, and I get that it doesn't transform the system, but we need to start with a signal, a political signal, right, that our city values its citizens more than it values the NYPD.
So let's talk a little bit about the way that the union has power over and leverage over a city of Democratic lawmakers. I mean, there's only a handful, not even a handful, there's a couple of Republicans who represent New York, at least at the city level. And yet the police union, which is extremely conservative, which is now documented to have been investigated for organized white supremacy within it, which turned the other, looked the other way when you had the Proud Boys, on the Upper East Side or all over New York, actually, right-wing Nazi group. So why can't anybody stand up to the police union?
Well, I think we're finally, that's part of what this fight is about, is standing up to them. I mean, I've been very clear in my messaging well before these protests throughout our campaign that we're going to stand up to right-wing law enforcement unions. I think what you said is so right, because the police department is 35,000 people. They're not all conservatives, obviously, but the police unions are controlled by right-wing reactionary people, often from Nassau County. They don't even live in the city. Frankly, they consider the city to be occupied territory where they have to deal with animals from the hood. Right? This is how they talk. This is how they speak on message boards. This is what they say in person. So that's what we're dealing with, is that this right-wing, probably the strongest right-wing political force in New York politics. And you can extend that to other law enforcement entities like the Correction Officers Union. So why are people so afraid to stand up for them? They are very good at weaponizing crime against politicians. So like I said, we passed bail reform in 2019. In 2020, there was a concerted effort from the law enforcement unions, the New York Post, to basically spam New Yorkers with headlines of crimes happening in the city and blaming that on bail reform and putting enormous political pressure on moderate liberal Democrats to denounce bail reform because it was leading to these crimes, which was, of course, all misleading, but it was very effective. And so just like you see in national politics, the right-wing machine, from talk radio to Fox, it's very effective no matter how wrong and evil it is, right? So that's what we're up against. And what makes me hopeful, is that we put out a letter on Monday with 47 now council candidates in 2021, as well as myself and a mayoral candidate, Diane Morales, all of us calling for $1 billion in budget cuts to the NYPD, and all of us denouncing police unions and saying we will refuse to take any law enforcement money in our campaigns in 2021. And that's unprecedented. And so I am hopeful that the next generation of city council members and political leaders in New York are ready to stand up to the law enforcement unions.
It's absolutely ridiculous that we even have to lobby for that. I mean, I know this is historic that letter went out, but I think it's absolutely ridiculous that you have so-called progressives in this city who have no problem getting arrested on the streets, showing up when the cameras are on for the photo ops and standing in solidarity, but behind the scenes taking money from the police union, showing up to their luncheon, which is a big event in New York politics, bipartisan event supposedly. Yeah. Janos, you're running for DA. You're progressive, running for DA, part of this big movement. But I've known you for a long time, and I think there could not be a better person to be running for a district attorney of New York City, of Manhattan. You understand so many aspects of power in New York. You've been there, so many fights. So tell me what your campaign is about and what you're up against.
Sure, I appreciate the kind words. I'm running because I want to make jail and prison a last resort in solving society's problems. Through my whole life, from growing up in New York City as a young person of color during the 1990s, to my work as an organizer, my work as a lawyer, my work on closed Rikers and at the ACLU, I believe we need to dismantle and transform our criminal justice system so that instead of locking people up, we look at how we can stop the underlying source of what's causing people to do harm and get their lives back on track. The good news is we already know how to do that in so many cases. We know that people need better mental health access, better substance use treatment access, better access to economic opportunities. And we're New York City. We're the richest city in the country and the richest country in the world. We have all the tools we need to do this correctly. So while we have an incumbent, Cy Vance, who's overly punitive against low-income communities of color, but looks the other way when powerful interests are before him, we want to do the opposite. We want to make sure that we give people a second chance. We get people's lives back on track. Meanwhile, we hold powerful interests accountable, whether that's employers who steal from workers via wage theft, landlords who criminally harass their tenants, or people who engage in political corruption, which, as you point out, is an old issue for me and something that I care deeply about. I'm not afraid to stand up to Democrats as well as Republicans when they're engaging in corruption. So that's what we're doing. The election is next spring. If people want to go to janosforda.com, they can learn more about what our campaign is doing. But from what you've heard today, I mean, this is what we're about. We're not just about electing me to office. This is about how we fit into the broader movement to transform the system. And we're going to keep doing that, whether it's on the streets or in the courtroom or anywhere else in the next year.
Yeah, I mean, folks might remember him, Cy Vance, for covering up the Harvey Weinstein investigation, too. So just one more piece of note for her. Great guy there. Janos, incredible work. Let's stay in touch. You're doing a marathon right now. It's not a sprint, but we're grateful to you, and I can't wait to see you representing all of us. Well, at least those who live in Manhattan, but I know that you're going to be representing all of New York, and building, the model for the rest of the country. So keep up the amazing work. Stay safe out there, and we appreciate you.
I appreciate you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you to Alex Vitali, to Ralikh Hayes, and to Janos Marton, and of course to our patrons who are making this show happen. Special thanks to Dorsey Shaw, who is back in New York. He is definitely making this show happen, who's on our team, and Kelly and George as well. Have a great week. Stay safe, stay healthy. If you can, if you're not out on the streets, stay inside and be well.